Hello, this is Dr. Hanaa Assil, and this video is on reproduction in flowers. So this has to do with biology of combined science or of the O-level IGCSE. Okay, we know that if a plant gives flowers, that means it is doing sexual reproduction. And the first thing we need to know is the parts of the flower. So what are the parts of the flower? Remember that a flower has a male part and a female part. So the male part is called the stamen, and it is made up of the anther and the filament. Can you see that on the right? So anther and filament make up the male part of the flower, and that is called the stamen. The female part of the flower is made up of stigma, style, ovary, and ovule. Can you see that? The stigma, style, ovary, and ovule make up the female part, which is called the carpel, or sometimes it is called the pistil. So stigma, style, ovary, ovule, these are the female parts. In addition to that, we have the large colored petals and the sepal, which is a green leaf-like structure at the bottom of the flower. So let's take a look at the functions of each of these. Why would a flower have large colored petals with scent? In order to attract insects for pollination, and we will talk about pollination in a minute. Now, can you see where the sepal is? The sepal is that leaf-like structure at the bottom of the flower. This is actually a part that protects the flower when it is a bud. A bud means when the flower is just starting to grow, then the sepals surround it and protect it. And then once the flower opens up, then the sepals just remain at the bottom of the flower. So the function of the sepals is to protect the flower when it is a bud. Now, we said the stamen is the male part of the flower. Do you remember we said it's made up of what? It's made up of the anther, and the anther is the one that contains the pollen grains. And the pollen grains are tiny cells that contain the male nucleus. Then we have the long, thin part that carries the anther, that is called the filament. So the anther and the filament make up the male part, which is the stamen. Now, the female part of the flower is called the pistil or the carpel. And the pistil or the carpel is made up of stigma, which is the upper part of that female part. The stigma, this is sticky to collect pollen grains, and this is if we're talking about an insect pollinated flower, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the style is the long part that holds the stigma, and then we have the ovary. This contains ovules, and the ovules are the ones that contain the female nucleus. Are we following so far? Okay. So we said the anther is the male part of the flower. The anther carries pollen grains, or it produces pollen grains, and the pollen grains are the ones that have the male nucleus. So let's take a look at this. Did you remember the names? So if we have a flower like that, what is the name of A and what is the name of B? You should remember that A is what? A is the petal and B is the sepal. Okay, what about this one? If he says the diagram shows a section through an insect pollinated flower, which labels are correct? So number one, is number one the anther or number two the anther? Which one is the anther? You should realize that number one is the anther, and number two is the stigma. Number three is the petal, and number four is the sepal. So my answer here is A. Can you see that? Remember, you're choosing A or B or C or D based on the fact that all the choices in A are correct or all the choices in B are correct. But here all the choices in A are correct. Okay, what are the correct labels and functions for parts X and Y? So what is X and what is Y? You should remember, what is X? We said X is petal or sepal. X is petal. So my answer is A or B. Now, what's the function of the petal? We said the petal attracts insects. Now, what is Y? You should remember what is Y. Y is the anther, and the anther is the one that produces pollen grains, so my answer is A. Then, in order for the flower, of course, the plant is making flower in order to reproduce. Reproduce means it is trying to make seeds that will grow again to form a new plant. So the first step in that process is pollination. You should remember that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. We said the pollen grains are made in the anther. Now, we need them to go to the female part, which is the stigma. So when pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma, this process is called pollination. Now, we can have two types of pollination. The anther can go from, the pollen grain, can go from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower, or to another flower on the same plant, and that is called self-pollination. So if the pollen grains of the flower go to its own stigma, or the stigma of a flower on the same plant, that is called self-pollination. But if the pollen grains of a flower go to the stigma of a flower on a different plant, of course it has to be the same species, then this is called cross-pollination. Okay, how does the pollen grain move from the anther to the stigma? Well, we can have one of two methods that we need to study. One method is by insects. So pollination can occur by insects. This is because insects need to feed on nectar. The nectar is the sugary fluid inside the flower. So the insects need to feed on the nectar. And when they stand inside the flower trying to feed on the nectar, then the pollen grains attach to its body, so that after that it can be carried to the stigma of another flower. So if we have a flower, it could be pollinated by insects. Now, what does it have to allow it to be pollinated by insects? Or how is this flower adapted to pollination by insects? You should realize that if a flower is going to be pollinated by insects, then it has large, brightly colored petals with scent to attract the insects. It also contains nectar for the insects to come and feed on, and the stigma is sticky and inside the flower, and the anther is small and inside the flower. So if a flower has all of these characteristics, then it is going to be pollinated by insects. But what if it does not have that? So if I have a flower that has large anthers hanging out with long flexible filament, and the stigma is long, feathery, and hanging out of the flower, and the flower does not have any large colored petals, no scent, no nectar, then this flower is pollinated by wind. So if we say, how is this flower adapted to pollination by wind? It has large anthers hanging out to expose the pollen grains to the wind. It has long feathery stigma hanging out in order to catch the pollen grains from the wind. So this is a flower that is pollinated by wind. Also, if we have a flower that is pollinated by insects, so this is an insect pollinated flower, how will the pollen grains look like? The pollen grains will be large with rough surface so that they can attach to the body of the insect. But if a flower is pollinated by wind, what would its pollen grains look like? They are small, light, smooth, so that they can be carried easily by the wind. Can we see the differences between insect-pollinated flowers and its pollen grains, and wind-pollinated flower and its pollen grains? So let's take a look at this. The diagram shows a section through a flower in which parts of the flower are pollen grains produced and received. Which part of the flower will produce pollen grains? Remember, we said pollen grains are produced by the anther. Which of these is the anther? It's Q. So pollen grains are produced by Q, the anther. Now, when we have pollination, the pollen grains will go from the anther to what? They will go from the anther to the stigma. Now, where is the stigma? The stigma is P, so my answer is A. Here he says the diagram shows a flower. Which row is correct for the flower illustrated? Of course, when I look at the diagram, obviously the anther is hanging out, the stigma is feathery and hanging out. So this is a flower that is pollinated by wind. So X, what does X do? You should realize that X is the anther. So it produces pollen grains. Now, if it produces pollen grains and it is wind pollinated, will the pollen grains be rough or smooth? Remember, for a wind pollinated flower, the pollen grains are smooth. What is Y? Y is the feathery stigma. Now, what is its function? Captures the wind carried pollen. So my answer is D. The diagram shows pollen grains from two different plants. How are the two pollen grains dispersed? So, number one, pollen grain 1, is this by insect or by wind? If it is smooth surface, then by wind. 2 has a rough surface, that's by insect. So my answer is C. Suggest which pollen grain comes from a wind-pollinated flower. Of course, if we look at the two pollen grains, we said the one that is from a wind-pollinated flower will be which one? The one that has a smooth surface to be carried easily by the wind. So that is F. So remember that for wind-pollinated flowers, the pollen grains are smooth, light, small, easily carried by the wind. This diagram shows a diagram of a wind-pollinated flower and a diagram of an insect-pollinated flower. Describe how the anthers of X are adapted for wind pollination. Where is X? So obviously, the anther in X is large and hanging out, and this allows it to expose the pollen grains to the wind. Now, give two pieces of evidence that show that Y is an insect-pollinated flower. Of course, why do we say Y is insect-pollinated? Can you see Y on the right? Well, it will be pollinated by insect. You can say because it has large petals. Of course, you can't see that it's colored, but we can say it has large petals. And this is to attract the insects. And the anther and stigma are inside the flower. They're not hanging out. So this shows that this flower is pollinated by insects. Then once pollination has happened, the next step is fertilization. So the pollen grains are now on the top of the stigma. Now what we need is fusion of male and female nucleus to form a zygote. So remember, definition of fertilization is fusion of male and female nucleus to form a zygote. But our problem now is that the male nucleus is inside the pollen grain and the female nucleus is inside the ovule. Can you see where the ovule is? So how are they going to meet together? Well, stigma will secrete a sugary fluid. This causes the pollen grain to start growing a tube going down the style. Can you see that? So the pollen grain starts to grow a pollen tube that goes down the style all the way to the micropyle. Can you see the micropyle? The micropyle is a small hole in the ovary or going to the ovule, so that now the male nucleus that is in the pollen grain will go down the pollen tube, enter through the micropyle and fuse with the female nucleus in the ovule. Are we paying attention? So we want fertilization to happen. That means we need to fuse male and female nucleus to form a zygote. Now, the male nucleus in the pollen grain up there goes down through the pollen tube, enters through the micropyle, and fuses with the female nucleus inside the ovule. So remember that the pollen grain remains up there on the stigma. what comes down through the pollen tube is the male nucleus. It fuses with the female nucleus in the ovule, and that forms a zygote. Now, this zygote will cause the ovule to become an embryo and then become seeds. So after fertilization, the ovules inside the ovary become seeds, and the ovary itself becomes the fruit. So if we're eating a tomato, the tomato itself was the ovary in the flower, while the seeds inside it were the ovules inside the flower. So any fruit that we have, an apple for example, the apple itself used to be the ovary of the flower, and the seeds inside the apple used to be the ovules. Also, if we're looking at peas, the seeds of the peas are the ovules, and the outside cover of the pea fruit is the ovary, or it used to be the ovary in the flower. So if the question says describe fertilization in a flower, what is fertilization? It is fusion of male nucleus from the pollen grain. Remember that fertilization is the same whether we're talking about flowers or we're talking about human reproduction. But here he's trying to be specific in a flower. So fertilization is the fusion of male nucleus, which is in the pollen grain, with the female nucleus in the ovule to form a zygote. Once the ovule becomes seed, then the seed can start to grow to form a new plant. So any seed has an outer cover, which is called the testa. It has a store of food, which we call the cotyledon. It has the embryo, which is made up of radicle and plumule. And you should remember that the radicle is the one that grows to form root, and the plumule is the one that grows to form shoot. We also have in the seed that tiny little hole called micropyle. Remember that the micropyle during fertilization allowed the male nucleus to enter to fuse with the female nucleus. Now, when the seed is starting to grow, the micropyle also will allow water to go in so that the seed can start growing, and that is called seed germination. So when the seed starts to grow into a new plant, that is called seed germination. Now, what does the seed need in order to start growing? In order for a seed to start germinating, you need to give it water to activate the enzymes which will break down the food stored in the cotyledon. You need to put it at a suitable temperature for optimum enzyme activity, and you need to give it oxygen or air for respiration to release energy for growth. So once you give the seed all of this, water, suitable temperature, oxygen, it starts to grow. Now, which part will grow first? You should realize that the radicle is the first one that will grow. And the radicle grows to form the root. But we don't call it the root at the beginning. We call it radicle. Now, the plumule is the one that grows upward to form the shoot or the stem. So the plumule will grow after that and start to form leaves. Once it forms leaves, then the plant can start doing photosynthesis and store its own food. But while it is going through the process of germination, it is relying on the food stored in the cotyledon. Okay, let's take a look at this question. Which conditions are needed for the germination of seeds? He's giving me a choice of oxygen, suitable temperature, water. Remember, we just said all of these are needed, so actually my answer is D. The diagram shows 4 tubes set up to investigate germination. All of the tubes are at 25 degrees Celsius, so that is suitable for germination. Now he's asking in which tube will the seeds germinate first. Remember, we said, what do we need? Now, what do we have in these tubes? We have either carbon dioxide or oxygen. Of course, we said we need which gas for germination? We need oxygen. So my answer is B or D. Now, Do I want it to be dry or do I want it to be wet cotton wool? Of course, I need water, so the one that will germinate is the one that has oxygen and water. Okay, and that's the end of this part. I hope this was useful. If you feel it was useful, please share with others so that they can benefit from it, and continue listening. Thank you for listening.